Great. So thanks again for inviting me to talk about this. I'll talk about it briefly. I will not cover today much of the quantitative and modeling aspects of this question, but I will question whether we can see a systematic turn in transition studies. Some have argued that we can. Why more systematic research might be relevant, how this could be done, and where this might lead to next. Here we go. So first of all, why? So there are a number of motivations for more systematic knowledge, regardless of the field, but I'm going to try to focus on transition studies specifically. So first, scientific arguments. So these concern or relationship to explanation and types of evidence we mobilized. So the first one is one about robustness. So consolidating a field's claims. So as a field like ours, which is rather young, matures, findings become more and more robust, and there are methodological arguments and strategies to work towards that. There are very different criteria for robustness. A second motivation might be the pluralization of the field's claims, so seeking more variety into what we say, the insights we find, and the kinds of proof that we mobilize, the kinds of explanation. A third scientific argument is to engage with other fields, because I mean, transition studies is a very interesting and relevant field, but it cannot cover everything, and it mobilizes insights from other fields. It comes into dialogue with other fields, and there developing more systematic knowledge might be done against the criteria of translatability. Can the findings, the insights be translated to other fields or to other approaches? The second set of arguments are those to do with the science policy interface and the science practice interface, because we want to shape the world in which we live. So this is about interventions. And here arguments are that one might want to develop more systematic research to support decision-making, so to develop more actionable insights, for instance, to support the administration of programs, innovation programs, transition programs, etc. And there might be a criteria of developing more measurable, more harmonized measurements for the phenomena that we are researching and trying to intervene on. And third one is to support practice, and their criteria might be, can you develop knowledge that is more systematic in terms of the learning and the insights, the recipes, the advice that you might be able to bring on board. Next slide. So there are a couple of tensions and trade-offs. I just wanted to go through them very quickly. On the one hand, you could locate in-depth case studies, which is the primary method within transition studies so far. And the kind of evidence that is mobilized is very particular. It thrives on very accurate and detailed representations of stories, these rich longitudinal case studies. They are very context dependent, and the findings can be very situated to this context. So how much can be generalized from them is always a question. And there's an argument that these kinds of methods are very suited for very complex phenomena with emergent properties. On the other hand, and this relates to other sorts of philosophies of science and knowledge, much more formal approaches, of which modeling, but others as well. And there, the one criterion or one objective would be to lead to more standardization of findings. So a principle could be more generalizable, more simple findings, models, and frames of interpretation. The idea is that the relationship to evidence, to empirical settings, is more extracted from the context, so more acontextual kinds of knowledge. And some have argued that this kind of method is suited to complicated phenomena or low complexity phenomena, high complexity phenomena like transitions pose a lot of challenges, and these will for sure be discussed in this module. And in between, something that transition studies has done a lot are heuristic and comparative approaches. So there, one of the objectives might be developing sort of engaging with a diversity of circumstances, of kinds of cases, of patterns and outcomes in these cases, so different transition pathways, for instance. And the criterion could be, can we compare different kinds of transitions, different kinds of diffusion mechanisms, etc. And here this trade-off is very well, I think, represented by Bruno Turnheim in this book, Pandora's Hope, where he suggests that on the left side, you have these very particular, localized, context-dependent cases. On the right hand, you have this much more standardized textual forms of knowledge that can be extracted from these particular cases. And he suggests that there's always a trade-off, regardless of your methodology, your approach, between reducing this richness of the local and the particular, which allows you to develop more general findings, and amplifying local observations to more standardized methods. So there's always a trade-off. The balance between them will depend on your own cases, on your own research, and there's no perfect solution to this. I think I might skip this because I think this is probably, well, I'll go very quickly. There are 4 underpinning philosophies of science that allow us to make theoretical arguments about what a robust claim is. And these 4 are to some extent represented in transition studies. So for this reason, it's relevant. On the one hand, very close to these formal methods is this theory of knowledge of positivism. So one reality, one singular truth exists, and we seek general laws. We make hypotheses and we can verify them through models. We can try to reproduce findings. On the other end, constructivism suggests that there's multiple constructed realities. Actors and contexts are important, their interpretations are important. So methodological strategies will seek deconstruction of these realities. And knowledge inferred from these cases will always be relative. And critical realism and pragmatism, 2 schools of thought that you find in transition studies, are more about revealing underlying structures, finding reasonable accuracy rather than perfect or unattainable, and sufficient kind of enough evidence, comparable evidence to support claims. So then, concerning empirical and methodological strategies, how do we move towards more systematic research within transition studies? So the question really could be boiled down to how deep do we zoom in, how far do we zoom out? And the answer, as always in transitions, is somewhere in the middle. So there are 3 types of strategies. A quantitative one that I won't talk much about is developing large N studies. So instead of individual, very specific case studies, a very large number of case studies with formal methods, statistical decomposition, not done very much in transition studies. Another one is to model phenomena, something that is developed more and more, and there are different kinds of models, different objects, different relationships between objects and different change logics within these models. This will be covered. And then another question is, how do you measure transition? And I really invite you to read this special issue and the debate around this of energy research and social sciences, which sought to well, suggested that we could measure transitions and how, and there are very many different ways of doing this. Benjamin Sovacool's article was very contested, and Arnulf Grudler answered to that, suggesting that you're comparing apples and oranges. You're looking at the development of appliances and the diffusion of entire systems, and you can't compare that. So on the right-hand side, he showed that you simply can't compare 2 things that aren't the same phenomena. And there's something really important there, and something that really needs to be understood if one is to compare transitions empirically. Another strategy is to go for smaller comparisons of single cases, so small n comparisons. And here I think it's very important to have a good selection rationale for your case studies. And I really like this paper by Bengt Flyvberg, who contrasts this formal approach of selection, this random selection of representative samples to avoid biases, with strategies that can be deployed with a smaller number of cases. So one strategy is to choose cases that are extreme or deviant, so deviant, sorry. So to explore highly unusual dynamics, an exceptionally good example of a transition that was fast and successful, an exceptionally bad example of a transition that was just never happened maybe. Another strategy is to seek maximum variation. So where you want to explore the significance of key dimensions on a transition. And here the mobilization of pathways is, of typologies of pathways is very interesting. So you could select a case of destabilization that has been induced primarily by a crisis. So a crisis pattern, very dramatic kind of destabilization, and contrast that with a much more slower gradual erosion type of pattern. So that's one strategy, to choose two cases, etc., etc. And I'm not going to go into the detail, but I think these are useful references. And of course, transition studies and MLP is a point in case here, but this as well, of mid-range theories that are these heuristic approaches, typologies that can allow us to trace patterns. And this, of course, once you're going beyond single case study, is very useful to deploy these typologies to situate cases between each other. I won't talk, well, yeah, and recently there has been a move, and I think this is really interesting, towards meta-analysis of cases. The problem with these is that when you compare 20 cases of historical transitions, for instance, you can't go into great detail about their functioning. Yet it brings us closer to have a bird's eye view, at least, of how different transition pathways may have unfolded in different cases, in different circumstances. And bridging strategies I will talk about mostly next week, so I will skip that. So a third and last situation in which one might be looking to deploy more systematic approaches is when in a circumstance of intervening, so these policy and practice circumstances. And here the main question could be, what kind of knowledge is relevant? A policymaker is not looking for knowledge that bears the standards of scientific proof. They're looking for actionable, for instance, knowledge that is good enough, reasonably accurate to support intervention, for instance. Another way policymakers mobilize evidence is through looking at cases. But one of the problems there is that they tend to look for these wonderful success cases. And when we're in discussion with policymakers, we really try to stress that transitions being such a difficult, rare, problematic phenomena, you want to look at the cases of failure as well. Another way systematic knowledge has been developed from transitions research is one focused on learning. And here there's a very interesting work done by Climate Kick, for instance. Christian Matti has been very influential in this, in developing practitioners' toolboxes and guides for, practitioners who are embarking on transition management practices. And there, the kinds of insights are very different from pattern analysis that we develop in transition studies. Another challenge for intervention, systematic knowledge for intervention, is the question of evaluation. So what kind of metrics and indicators can we develop? And this is really cutting edge for transition studies. We don't have a uniform way of measuring transitions. We don't even have agreement on what are the relevant bits to be measured. And a last frontier that I think is particularly interesting is this question of mapping transitions, mapping, situating ourselves. Where are we? What is the current state of the socio-technical configuration in which we operate? Where are ongoing transitions headed? And can we characterize some of the future options for reconfigurations? And here one might look at intermediary kinds of metrics or mechanisms or qualifiers for dynamics, such as speed, scale, scope. So how fast, how large, how far-ranging are the changes that we can observe in practice. And I just want to close here just to show you the sort of the range of frontiers, basically, for more systematic and more comparative approaches in transition studies. So one has been trialed and tested is that of developing and mobilizing typologies as heuristics to make sense of transition patterns. So really the Smith et al. Paper and Geels and Scott 2007 are really typical of this, but we have a multiplication of these typologies as really relevant frames to compare and position different transition dynamics against one another. Another one is to contrast cases, and their very careful selection criteria is really important. So you're not just choosing cases because you like them or because you have access to them. You're choosing cases because you're going to be able to comparatively say something meaningful from contrasting them together. Another frontier to me is taxonomies and maps, and this is really related to modeling. So you have, for instance, Marletto et al. Have published a book where they try to develop more formal, qualitative but formal methods for mapping, positioning systems, and comparing them against each other with the objective of being able to say something meaningful about their future developments. Very early days for these kinds of methods, but really interesting front. Meta-analysis, I've already mentioned. I think this is really something worthwhile. And last, formalization, whether measurements, or indicators and metrics, and modeling. And I think we'll talk about this quite a lot for the next coming weeks, so I won't dwell on this. I just want to finish on this quote from the agenda paper led by Jonathan with a number of colleagues from transition studies, because to me, really, this is very clear about the direction this agenda is going. So the key methodological challenge remains to combine in-depth attentiveness to particularity with the development of generic insight. There's really these trade-offs, and one has to be aware of them when treading on that road. The overall direction for future transition research involves a continued dedication to in-depth single-case research design. So this is what we have done, what we're good at, and what we will continue doing regardless. Still, there is an unmistakable drive towards more systematic comparison and theory building from cases. And this is wonderful things to see. It's really, I'm really glad and to see these kinds of developments maturing within the field. Thank you.